Hello everyone and welcome to another video here in this VATSIM series surrounding the release of the brand new audio for VATSIM. My name is Evert from the AviationPro channel on YouTube, and in today's video we'll cover a lot of items and I will take you through it. First of all, we'll take a look at how to configure your microphone and we'll kind of take a look at what microphones are the best options to choose when flying on VATSIM, especially with the new audio system. And then we'll take a look at how to fly with the new audio for VATSIM by taking a look at some basic radio theory and transmitting etiquette and techniques, and giving you some tips on how to make use of the new system and what to do and what not to do. And we'll end this video with some frequently asked questions in order to help you out and make your start using the new audio for VATSIM as smooth as possible. Okay, so let's talk about microphones first of all. And the first thing that we want to talk about is that you have to select a proper microphone. Now, what works best with VATSIM and with the new audio system is simply a headset with a boom microphone, something like this. It doesn't have to be expensive. It can be rather cheap. Make sure you check out some reviews on YouTube, for example, in order to get a proper headset. But this is the type of headset that works best when flying. Right? You have the audio coming through the ears, which is really nice. If you have the audio of the ATC running separately through the headset, you're much better at able at distinguishing the audio from all the other sounds that are in your flight simulator. And then you also have the microphone, of course. The microphone is a so-called boom microphone. It's kind of designed to run alongside your cheek, and in that way, if you wear it properly, you can sound very nicely over the VATSIM network using the new audio system. So there we go. And now I have my headset on. As you can hear, I'm now running the audio through this headset. And basically, if you have a boom microphone, you want to make sure that it's kind of positioned, just to the side of your mouth, along your cheek, and just below, about like 2 centimeters to the sides and 2 centimeters below your mouth. And this is kind of the perfect audio setting. This way the sound is not exaggerated and the controllers and pilots can hear you properly, okay? So it depends a little bit on the headset, what the position of the microphone should exactly be. But you can imagine if I put this microphone, directly in front of my mouth, it's going to sound very distorted, and other pilots and other controllers will not like that, okay? So make sure that you select a nice headset with a boom microphone. Make sure you configure it properly in your pilot client so that you sound all right, and just make a simple audio recording of yourself so that you know how you sound over the network. And this way we can all contribute to an overall good sound quality. I mean, the audio codec is of course improved, but that doesn't mean that we should not wear our headsets and microphones properly, okay? So make sure that you keep it in mind. Now, of course, there are other types of microphones out there. For example, standalone microphones on your desk, or maybe microphones inside monitors or inside a laptop. However, they pick up a lot of background noise, and that's not ideal for flying on VATSIM. The controllers really want to hear your voice directly without picking up a huge amount of engine sound, for example. So just make sure that you make a small investment into a nice little headset, and that will definitely improve your experience with the new audio system for VATSIM. Okay, so now that we got ourselves a proper headset with a nice microphone and it's properly set up, now it's time to transmit on the VATSIM network. And there's a couple of things to keep in mind, especially with the new audio system. Okay, so let's take a look. So let's take a look at some basic theory, first of all, to get you going with the new audio for VATSIM. Now, like before, tuning a frequency is pretty similar. Basically, in your pilot client, you will still find an active list of ATC frequencies of controllers. However, when you tune the frequency, you will not hear this chime anymore that you are on the voice channel, because you're not actually joining some sort of voice channel like before. You're actually, going on a frequency, and you just start talking and transmit into the virtual environment around you, okay? So it's a bit different. However, you will still see active air traffic control frequencies in your pilot clients. Now, with the new audio for VATSIM, it's very important that you properly configure your audio control panel so you can properly transmit and receive on the correct frequency. So make sure that the correct frequency is tuned, and also make sure that transmit and receiving buttons are properly selected inside your radio. It depends a little bit on what aircraft add-on you use. Make sure you review the documentation, but if the audio control panel is not properly set up, especially when you do a cold and dark startup, for example, then you may not be able to transmit on the frequency. So make sure that you give that a good review. Now, as I said before, you will find a list of active frequencies in your pilot client. However, basically all VHF frequencies inside the aviation spectrum are always available. available on the VATSIM network. You can tune any frequency and talk in principle. However, of course, when ATC is online, you should tune their frequency, and when there's no ATC online, the standard frequency to talk on is still Unicom on 122.8 or 122.8. The big difference now, of course, is that you can actually use voice on Unicom. You do not have to use text per se. And it's important to understand that the 122.8 Unicom frequency is artificially restricted to a 15 nautical miles radius around your aircraft. So you will not be able to transmit and receive in a huge distance, just enough so you can, reach other aircraft around you, especially near airports, so you can coordinate with them how to, separate for the approach, for example, or how to separate for the departures. Now, in the future for audio for VATSIM, the plan is to actually also use local frequencies, so-called local common traffic advisory frequencies for airports. However, to ease the transition to the new audio for VATSIM, 122.8 is still the basic frequency. When there's no ATC online, you should tune 122.8, and there you can coordinate with other traffic via voice in order to ensure enough separation between you and other traffic. Another good thing to know is that high frequency radios are also simulated. However, pay-aware aircraft developers do not really simulate HF radios yet, so basically on VATSIM you will be tuning a VHF alias frequency in order to join an HF frequency. However, the HF itself will actually sound like an actual HF radio, don't worry. When pay-aware developers of aircraft add-ons are able to integrate HF radios, then VATSIM will also support this. So hopefully in the future, when aircraft add-ons are improved and you can actually make use of the HF radio inside the aircraft, you will be able to actually tune that frequency instead of having to use a VHF alias. But for now, again, a VHF alias frequency is used, so make sure that you're aware of that. Now let's take a look at some theoretical principles for the new audio for VATSIM that are very important to understand when you start transmitting, okay? Now, VHF communications are based on a line of sight to a transmitter, and the audio for VATSIM actually simulates this. This means several things. First of all, radio reception improves as an aircraft climbs, so the higher you climb, the better able you are to transmit to radio towers on the ground and other aircraft around you, and the more you will be able to receive, okay? At low altitudes or on the ground, you actually may not be able to hear certain ATC stations. For example, if you're on the ground and you cannot reach an air traffic controller via voice, you have to make sure that, first of all, of course, everything is correctly set up on your side, on your audio control panel, for example. However, it's also likely that you're actually in an area where you simply cannot reach any ATC radio tower. This would also be possible in real life. If this happens, make sure that you private message that controller and ask for further instructions. Another thing to bear in mind with this is that at certain times you may be able to hear ATC, but you cannot hear the pilot that they are talking to. That's simply because, that pilot is further away from you than you are from ATC. For example, that pilot might be approaching from the other side of the country than you are flying into. For example, if you're flying in from the east and another aircraft is flying in from the west, that other aircraft may be too far away for you to receive. So at times you may hear ATC giving some sort of instruction, but you do not hear a reply from the other pilots. However, you know that the pilot is actually responding. So you have to take a little bit of care here that you do not transmit over the pilot who is likely responding to air traffic control. And of course, as you fly away from a radio tower or any radio station, whether that be an aircraft or an air traffic control radio tower, you will experience signal degradation. So the communication quality will reduce, but this is normal. This happens in real life, and that's now simulated using the new audio for VATSIM. Now again, VHF aviation radios are half duplex, so when you transmit you cannot hear others, you will not be able to receive. Now if you cannot hear other traffic for an extended period of time, let's say over 30 seconds, make sure that you are checking your pilot client and that you're not accidentally transmitting or have a stuck mic. This is very important, and make sure that the frequency is open for other traffic. Now when two users transmit at the same time, you will hear a so-called blocking tone, this little buzz tone like this. This simply happens when two users accidentally transmit at the same time, but those two users have no idea that they're actually blocking each other. Only other people on the frequency will hear that. So sometimes it takes a little bit of getting used to. Sometimes the controller or autopilots may need to advise each other that one of the transmissions was blocked because two parties were transmitting at the same time. So this is something that you have to take into account. A blocked transmission can happen, and when this happens, a blocking tone will show up. And that means that none of those two transmissions actually came through. So it takes a bit of coordination. Just make sure that you are aware of that. So now that we've covered some basic radio theory, let's take a look at some transmitting techniques and etiquette, and some of this theory will come back in the following segment.
Now, before you start your flight and before you start transmitting in the first place, make sure that the output volume of the air traffic control or other pilots, if you're controlling, is properly set so that you can, properly hear the ATC through your headset and that you don't have any problems with audio before you start flying or controlling. Now let's think of a situation. Let's say we've just departed out of Amsterdam runway 24. We're passing 2,000 feet and we switch to the departure controller. Now it's very, very important, especially with the new audio system, that you really listen out on the frequency, just like in real world. When you switch frequencies, you do not transmit immediately. You always listen out to make sure that another instruction has been finished. Now let's say, for example, the departure control is also an approach controller, and he's dealing with some traffic that's entering the ILS of runway 18 right. Now, when you switch frequencies, you might hear something like
KLM 123, turn right heading 150, cleared ILS approach, runway 18 right.
Now, if you hear that, you should not immediately jump in. You should not say like, hey, KLM 56 kilo, passing 2,000 feet on the Andic 1 Sierra departure. That's not the way it works. You have to wait for the other instruction to be finished because you still expect a reply from the other pilot that's still on the approach on 18 right. So you still expect that pilot to say something like this.
Turn right heading 150, cleared ILS approach, runway 18 right, KLM 123.
So now that that instruction has been finished and you do not expect any other reply from the controller or the pilot, then it's safe to transmit and say that you're on the departure in this case. Okay, so always make sure that an instruction is fully finished, and when you do not expect a reply from the controller or the pilot, then you can transmit. So always listen out. It's very, very important. Now, why is this important with the new audio system? It's because, again, this system is half duplex. It simulates an actual VHF or HF radio. So when you transmit, you cannot receive. So if you immediately start transmitting once switching the frequencies, you have no idea what other, communication is still going on. So make sure that you listen out on the frequency for a couple of seconds, understand the situation, and if after 10 seconds, for example, you don't hear anything, then it's safe to transmit. And otherwise, again, wait for the other instructions to be fully finished and replied by either by the controller or the pilot. Okay, so then it's time to transmit. Again, make sure that your microphone is properly placed. Don't move it about while you're transmitting. And also make sure that you have set a push to talk button, in your pilot client or ATC client so you can actually transmit on the network. Now, when you transmit and when you start speaking, just speak nice and evenly with a normal, calm tone, and do not exaggerate your volume. Just try to speak clearly and evenly in terms of speed and volume, okay? So, for example, in this case, we were on a departure and we could say something like this.
Schiphol departure, KLM 56 kilo, passing 2,000 feet, Andic 1 Sierra departure.
As you can see, nice and even, not too fast. And if you're giving specific information, or especially as a controller giving a lot of information to the pilot, make sure that you slow down a little bit when giving that information, especially, for example, a lot of taxiways. For example, the controller might tell you something like KLM 56 kilo, taxi to gate Bravo 58 via Alpha, Delta, Foxtrot, something like that. In that case, you just slow down a little bit so that the pilot in this case can write down the information. So just make sure, that you speak with a nice, calm and even voice, and that you just keep the message concise. Now, of course, this takes a little bit of practice, especially if you're new to VATSIM. Now, thanks to the new audio system, we can pack more transmissions. So just like in the real world, message upon message really can follow up rather quickly. Okay, so you have to keep that in mind. And especially during events when it's busy, you have to keep those messages short. So you should not say, like, again, when we're departing,
hey, Schiphol departure, very good afternoon. This is KLM 56 kilo, departing On deck 1 Share departure, runway 24, passing 2,500 feet.
You know, this is very long. It might not even be proper phraseology being used here, okay? So just keep it nice and short, especially during events. You could say something like this.
Skip a departure, KLM 56 kilo, passing 2,000 feet, on deck 1 Share departure.
You know, very nice and short. Now, this doesn't mean that you cannot say goodbye or good day, you know, in your own language, but just keep in mind, especially when it's busy, leaving out those kind of elements and especially the long ers and you know, those kind of sounds. Of course, it takes a bit of practice, but leaving those kind of things out really speed things up and keep messaging very clear, okay? Another few things that you have to keep in mind while transmitting is that, especially in some regions where, you know, English is not the native language, you know, you might have to deal with accents. Now, luckily with the new audio system, you know, of course, the audio is going to be more clear, so the English is better to understand, but there's still going to be an accent. So make sure that you slow things down here as well. And of course, while you're transmitting, keep pushing that push to talk button, right? It's very important that you do that, and do not release the push to talk button until you're fully finished. If you cut out, you know, too soon, then the last part of your message might not be received by the controller or the pilot. Okay, so just make sure that during the entire transmission you keep pressing that push to talk button and do not release it until you're fully finished with your sentence. Now, if you've been eating a lot of greasy hamburgers, you know, fat kind of builds up around the push to talk button, and it might happen that you get a stuck mic. You know, this is something that happens in the real world as well. You know, just the mic gets stuck either physically or maybe something in your software is misconfigured. This is really something that you have to check out. Now, you can notice that by, you know, you can see in your pilot or ATC client that the transmit light might just show up, but sometimes you might not even be aware of this, and this is a real problem, especially in real life. But with the new audio system, this is even more of a problem because when you're transmitting, you do not receive. So nobody can tell you, hey, there's a pilot with a stuck mic. Please check your mic. You know, you don't hear that. You don't receive anything. So just be aware of that. Just make sure that, you know, when you're transmitting, that you properly release the push to talk key. And if there are any problems, that you fix it and go after frequency, okay? If your push to talk button is constantly pressed, you're also really annoying other pilots and controllers around you because they simply cannot get through. Their own transmission cannot get through either because the blocking sound will, show up. So it's really annoying. So again, make sure that the push to talk key is properly configured, properly cleaned, but also that you properly release it and do not abuse sort of the push to talk button by just, keeping it open all the time. That's not the way it works. Okay, so just keep that in mind. Now, when you're done transmitting, you can release the push to talk button again, and then you have to wait for a reply by the controller, for example, or wait for any further instructions. If there's a period of silence for about 10 seconds, if you haven't got a reply yet, then you can chime in and try again. Okay, sometimes the controller might be a bit too busy with handling something else, and then you might just need to repeat, but never just repeat after only 2 or 3 seconds. Give it some time, give the controller some time to reply, and in that way, you can keep the frequency open for other people as well. Okay, especially again during events, it's gonna get busy. Sometimes you might miss something, so it's again something to keep in mind. Now, the final thing I want to say about transmitting using the new voice system is that you have to realize that there's a lot of simulation behind this. Again, it's not just about the clarity of the audio or the reduced latency. There's also a very nicely VHF simulation. When you're transmitting, you're really transmitting in a virtual space around you, just like you would do in a real aircraft or in a real ATC tower. So keep that in the back of your mind. Make sure that you actually read the documentation of the new audio for VATSIM, so you have a bit of an idea of how the theory behind it works, and that you do not freak out when you cannot hear a controller properly, or maybe that you're too far away from a controller, or maybe that you are, for example, in a radio dead zone, where kind of no transmissions can be received, because that's the way it's being actually simulated, just like in real life. So that's something to just keep in mind, right? Make sure you understand a little bit of radio and VHF and HF theory as seen in the documentation, so that when transmitting you're aware of how it works. Again, it's not like a TeamSpeak or Discord channel anymore. This is really a nicely simulated VHF and HF radio, so make sure you check that out. Now, lastly, I can imagine there are, of course, a lot of questions. Luckily, in the documentation, they're linked in the description as well. There's a lot of information and some frequently asked questions. I want to pick and highlight some of them, especially related to the new technique behind all this, and answer them for you. You can review all the other questions being asked and their answers in the documentation, so make sure you check it out. Now, when you're flying or controlling, you might wonder, why do some pilots or some controllers sound louder than others? Now, again, this is all to do with simulation behind this whole audio system. It might be that one pilot is further away from you than the other. In that case, a pilot that is closest to you will be read more loud and clear, literally, right? Because the pilot is closer, the signal degradation has not really come to as much effect as the other pilot. Maybe the other pilot is much further away, and those radio signals are already kind of degraded by the time they reach you. So this is really how it's simulated. So you have to keep that in mind. When you're flying, some pilots will be very audible, very loud and clear, but while other pilots that maybe are approaching from the other side of the country or the airport, for example, are a lot less clear. So this just varies depending on the variables that have been discussed before in prior videos. A similar question to this is, for example, hey, I can hear other pilots, but I cannot hear the controller, and the controller can't hear me either. What's going on? This is confusing. Normally on VATSIM, you just tune in a frequency. Everyone could hear each other exactly the same way, regardless of range. As soon as you saw the frequency pop up in your pilot client, you could tune in and talk. This is not the way it works anymore. Okay, you have to be within a certain range for the controller to hear you. So a pilot that's further ahead of you might already hear the controller and be able to, communicate, while you, who's farther behind, still has to wait for a proper range in order to hear the controller, right? So just be aware of this. This is simulated like the real world. So make sure that you, understand this theory behind it, so you do not freak out when you do not hear the controller yet. Okay, so keep that in mind. Another question can be is, why do I not hear other people transmit when I'm transmitting? Now again, that's because VHF and HF radios are half duplex. So previously on VATSIM, in the old system, you would hear all kinds of transmissions going on at the same time while you were transmitting as well. This is not the way it works anymore. If you transmit, you are blocking the receiving or incoming radio transmission, so you will not be able to receive. And that's something you have to keep in mind again. Now, why can I transmit on any frequency? That's a good question. Well, it's because frequencies do not open and close. Previously on VATSIM, a controller had to open a frequency, and then pilots would be able to join in. It's sort of a voice channel you could join into and start talking. But right now with this new system, it's like the real world. You're just a VHF radio, and when you transmit on a frequency, you transmit into virtual space, and other people can hear you if they are within range. Okay. Now this does not mean that you should tune all kinds of frequencies and have small talk with other pilots around you. The servers have to be kept as clean as possible, as you can imagine. So if you are in an area without ATC, you can of course use Unicom. Unicom 122.8 is still the standard frequency that you can use in order to coordinate the traffic and the situation with other pilots around you. Now previously you had to use text, but again, because you can transmit on any frequency, in this case the Unicom frequency, you can just transmit, and other pilots around you will immediately hear you, and you can coordinate with each other how you're going to arrive or depart out of an airport. Now you might say, okay, if all frequencies are available, why can't I use the local frequency for my airport when there's no ATC online? Kind of like it's done at uncontrolled airports in the real world. Well, this is planned in the future. Now, for the ease of the transition to the new system, Unicom is still going to be the standard frequency at all airports. So whenever you arrive into or depart out of an airport, make sure you coordinate with other pilots using 122.8 and do not tune a local tower frequency or anything. This is something the team will look into for the future plans, but for the time being, Unicom is still the standard frequency. Can I use the new voice codec to chat with my friends? Now, as I said before, this is not the way to go. You have to realize, the VATSIM server capacity and bandwidth is all dependent on donated resources. So luckily it's for free, but of course we want it to stay this way, right? So the radios on VATSIM should not be used for anything other than ATC coordination or coordinating with other traffic when no ATC is online. And you have to realize, if you abuse the system, you're violating the code of conduct of VATSIM, and that might lead to certain penalties on your VATSIM certificate. So just use it for ATC coordination and coordination with other traffic. If you want to talk with your friends, hey, there's other options out there like TeamSpeak or Discord. Feel free to use those kind of apps to chat with your friends. But on VATSIM, it's really just for simulating aviation radios and coordinating with traffic in ATC. Now again, there are more frequently asked questions in the documentation for audio for VATSIM, especially for controllers as well. So make sure you check it out. But I hope answering these few questions kind of make this a bit more clear. And I hope these tips and tricks kind of help you out as well.